When it comes to science-related topics in the news and on social media, I've started seeing more and more encouragement to do your own research. And the idea is great, with a caveat that it's done in a responsible way, as research, like anything else, can be done very well, very poorly, or anywhere in between. There's a video circulating right now of a physician at a school board meeting questioning and contradicting some of the more widely accepted science-based guidance related to COVID. Now, this kind of thing isn't new. It's happened through the course of the pandemic, it's happened with other scientific topics prior to COVID, and it will almost certainly continue to happen. And each time, it understandably leads to confusion. So I thought I'd use a few points in the video to highlight some important aspects of the process of science, and offer up a few things you can keep in mind that might help when researching scientific information. Not at all an exhaustive list, but hopefully one that will at least be somewhat useful. Let's start with this. The null hypothesis is critical when you're evaluating science. The null is what you expect data to look like, assuming a factor or treatment you're analyzing has no effect. I've talked about it previously, so if you want the details, see the video titled Interpreting Data, What's the Null? The null matters for at least a couple points the speaker tries to make in the school board video. For example, he points to his experience successfully treating COVID patients with a regimen that includes ivermectin, vitamin D, and zinc. It turns out to be a pretty extreme case of neglecting the null, similar to one I talked about in another earlier video on hydroxychloroquine and COVID. You can check that one out for more on this. The null could also give a useful context to the physician's point that 75% of individuals infected in the Massachusetts COVID outbreak were vaccinated. The takeaway here is this. The null is fundamentally important when evaluating data, as it provides important context. Without understanding and considering it, any statistics can easily be misleading. A second point is that science works in things like degrees of certainty, probabilities, and likelihoods. It doesn't operate in absolutes. There are several examples of this getting conflated in the school board video. First, the speaker is technically correct to say that masks don't stop the transmission of virus, if that term stop is being used in the absolute sense. But the relevant science is based on questions more along the lines of, do masks reduce the level of viral transmission? And if so, by how much? And what effect might such a reduction have on, say, something like amounts of symptomatic disease in a community? I did a few videos a while back that addressed some of that too. The banners at the top of the screen have links to a couple of those. In a second example, the speaker talks about making the virus completely go away, but that's never been the intention or a realistic goal with any policies or recommendations to this point, which are instead simply expected to reduce levels of spread in a probabilistic manner. Third, he emphasizes that no vaccine ever stops infection. Again, as it's presented in absolute terms, I don't think anybody would disagree, but it's also not that relevant when it comes to recommendations for getting any vaccine. While it's simpler to think in absolutes, say someone is either infected or not, the reality is that infection occurs along a gradient. Someone who has a single virus particle could be labeled infected just the same as someone who has a billion virus particles. But the likelihoods that each of those individuals will have symptoms or would spread the disease are drastically different. Talking in absolutes can be easier, as many of us don't intuitively think in the context of probabilities and likelihoods. In fact, that's probably a primary thing that many scientists have to work at in their training as they learn to do science well. But while it might make things easier to think about, it can also generate confusion, intentional or not. In these specific cases, the absolute claims just don't seem useful beyond creating something of a straw man argument. Science works in probabilities and degrees of certainty, not in absolutes. So if you hear claims being made in absolutes, it might be worth digging into at least a bit more to make sure they're appropriately representing the relevant science. Finally, building understandings and making claims in science in a responsible and effective way requires that all the relevant studies are considered. Science and data can often be somewhat messy and noisy, but that doesn't mean they're not useful. A critical aspect of doing science well is being able to extract the useful from the noise. It's somewhere expertise is really valuable. Depending on the topic, there could be tens, hundreds, or even thousands of relevant studies, and they don't necessarily all point to the same conclusion. The evidences from all the studies need to be considered and weighed, but there's more to that than just counting up the number that support one idea versus another. While many studies are informative, not all are equally informative. Each one has to be evaluated in terms of things like its specific goals, the appropriateness of the methods applied to the questions being asked, how broadly any conclusions can be applied, and how much power the study has to draw conclusions, among other things. Simply put, doing all this well can be a big task, especially when the body of relevant literature is large. And biases can sneak in, whether intentional or unintentional. For example, preferably searching for or selecting reports that fit some preconceived idea. There are indeed studies published that offer little or no evidence of an effect of masks on disease transmission. But to suggest that these make even a relatively substantial contribution to that weight of evidence in the context of the full body of current literature and knowledge on this topic, at least from my somewhat limited understanding, just doesn't seem right. This kind of situation is one area where professional and scientific organizations, societies, and agencies can be valuable, as they often uniquely bring together large numbers of individuals holding some of the highest levels of experience and expertise across a range of specialized disciplines relevant to a topic. These individuals can then offer input and provide checks on each other's interpretations and understandings of that full body of literature to try to reach a consensus. Of course, this doesn't make them infallible, but it's kind of hard for me to think of a better scenario for building the best understandings in the context of complex issues with large and continually growing bodies of evidence. Several high-profile groups like CDC, NIH, and state and local boards of health have received a number of criticisms recently, similar to those leveled in the school board video. Personally, I've seen little that warrants such criticisms, little that such groups have done that isn't well-founded in the best science available, at least as I understand it. Of course, any contrary view can and should be raised, but only if it arises from and can be justified when considering the whole of the evidence available. Hope maybe something in there helps clear up a bit of confusion, or might help if you find yourself doing your own research on any scientific-related topics going forward. If so, spread the word and subscribe to the channel to be in the loop for other videos down the road.